It's June of 2020. The Galwan Valley becomes the battleground for a fierce clash between Indian and Chinese soldiers. That night, in the dark, the Chinese used machetes, clubs embedded with nails, and batons wrapped with barbed wire to attack Indian soldiers, and in the end, killed about 20 of them. The Indian side retaliated and killed around 40 Chinese soldiers.
Two nuclear powers facing off in a remote corner of the Himalayas. Monday, Indian and Chinese soldiers fought on disputed land using stones and bamboo poles.
This was a turning point. The situation was tense and relations were never the same for these Asian powers ever since then. The Galwan clash? It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was China's failed attempt to grab some strategic territory from India, the world's largest democracy, and it backfired. Across the world, countries were already starting to push back against China's assertiveness. Think of the Philippines and the South China Sea. Same story, different players. And now India was making it clear. It wasn't going to play the silent bystander anymore. The bravery and resilience of India's soldiers sent a powerful message. This wasn't just a border skirmish. It was a loud statement that India would no longer be a passive player in the game of Asian geopolitics. But this was just the beginning. Fast forward to today, and India's bold stance is challenging the balance of power in Asia. And China is hating this. So let's understand. 1, how is India becoming scarier for China? 2, why has China's aggression failed against India? And most importantly, number 3, what strategies is India using to counter Chinese aggression? But before we begin, we want some help. We want a second of yours that will make sure that you keep receiving video updates about sensitive topics like wars and conflicts through our videos. Now, recently, YouTube has demonetized the video we published on the Iran-Israel conflict. But you can help us just by simply clicking on that like button below so that YouTube knows that you are loving our videos. Thank you so much. All right, let's go back to where this all started. The Galwan Valley, an important, rugged region in Ladakh, right near the Line of Actual Control, or LAC, becomes the scene of a fierce clash between Indian and Chinese troops. Now, to put it in perspective, the LAC isn't exactly a settled, peaceful border. It's more of an informal boundary that's always been a bit tense, and this time we saw that tension explode. The clash was brutal, leaving 20 Indian soldiers and about 40 Chinese soldiers dead. Why Galwan? Well, the valley is a big deal. It's not just a scenic spot up in the mountains, it's a strategic point for military operations. And this is because it gives access to critical roadways and supply routes. So control over Galwan means easier logistics, stronger defenses, and faster military mobilization, something both India and China want in their corner. After this deadly face-off, India didn't waste any time. It immediately ramped up its military presence along the LAC, sending in about 50,000 extra troops by the end of the year. And it wasn't just about the numbers. They brought advanced weapons, strengthened their supply lines, and upgraded infrastructure along the border to keep things running smoothly. But India didn't just flex its military muscle, it also opened up a diplomatic front, starting talks with China to try and ease the tensions without backing down an inch on the ground. On the other hand, after Galwan, China was suddenly facing a lot of international criticism. Other countries were watching closely, and China wasn't exactly winning any popularity points. The isolation and criticism started to make China rethink its approach. And finally, by early 2021, China started pulling back troops and easing off the aggression. But what did India achieve with all this? Well, a pretty strong message that its military was more than ready for any threats at its border. Now, the Galwan clash didn't just put India on high alert, it marked a real turning point in how India views its security along the LAC. After seeing just how risky an unguarded border could be, India realized it was time to ramp up its defenses. And this wasn't just about responding to one incident, it was a shift towards a more proactive defensive stance. Since Galwan, India has made some serious upgrades. Surveillance was totally revamped. Advanced drones now patrol the skies, and reconnaissance efforts have been strengthened to track any movement along the LAC in real time. Fast forward to 2024, India's approach has only become more vigilant, with enhanced monitoring systems and a strong focus on preventing any future incursions. So does this mean China has given up and won't repeat this in the future? Well, actually, probably not. Its territorial ambitions aren't going anywhere, and sooner or later it will show its true colors. So this means India has to be extremely cautious about it and start looking beyond just military might. In fact, India has already started doing it by strengthening its alliances. Today's episode is sponsored by the Walnut Fund. Ever thought about investing in walnut trees? It might sound a little nutty, but it's actually pretty smart. The Walnut Fund collects investments to plant and grow walnut orchards. To help people see how it works, the Walnut Fund has a simple calculator on their website. This tool shows you how much you could earn from your investment. Usually, you start seeing returns around the 4th year. You can expect to make a passive income each year for the next 35 plus years. On average, people make about 20% back each year, and the Walnut Fund team handles all the costs and work. So far, they've planted 12,000 walnut trees in Europe. They're also starting a big new farm with room for over 25,000 walnut trees, and this will be their biggest walnut orchard. Even the German TV channel Galileo made a short documentary about them. If you're curious about planting a financial tree for the future, head to their website to learn more. India has partnered with the US, Japan, and other allies to create a strong network of support. These aren't just friendly handshakes either. India is actively sharing intelligence, aligning strategies, and working together to counter any aggression moves from China. And here's where things get interesting. India, the US, Japan, and even other allies are forming a coalition to stand up to China's aggression. A move that's seriously rattling China. We'll dig into what this group is all about in a bit, but first let's talk about one of the biggest changes India's making to ensure it's better prepared than ever. And it's a move that's been a long time coming.
External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar emphasized that the Modi government has significantly enhanced border infrastructure in the last few years, particularly along the border with China.
Now, here's something important to understand. You could have the best trained soldiers and the most advanced weapons, but without solid infrastructure, all that power can add up to nothing. Just trying to mobilize troops or send ammunition up huge mountainous roads without the proper pathways in place, it's a recipe for disaster. And India knew that it had to change. So in 2024, India is making some serious moves to build up its infrastructure along the border with China. The government has allocated a huge $6 billion budget for these projects, covering everything from roads, railways, and airstrips. And do you want to know one of the biggest plans in motion? A 2,000-kilometer network of strategic roads designed to connect military bases to remote, hard-to-reach areas in the Himalayas and along the LAC. This network is more than just roads. It's India's lifeline for rapid response, allowing troops and supplies to reach critical areas faster than ever. With these upgrades, India's military readiness gets a real edge. Quick troop mobility means that if anything kicks off, Indian forces can respond in a fraction of the time it would have taken before. And you better believe China has noticed. They've reacted by speeding up their own military presence along the border and reportedly pumped around $5 billion into their own infrastructure near the LAC, building new roads, railways, and facilities. It's no surprise that tensions have spiked, with skirmishes and a major standoff flaring up in late 2023 in eastern Ladakh. But it's not just about military might. This infrastructure boost is also bringing benefits to the local economy. For the border regions, these new roads and railways mean more market access, easier transportation, and an increase in employment opportunities. Here are some of the biggest projects India's been doing with its infrastructure along the border. Firstly, there's the Ladakh Connectivity Project, which is basically all about making it easier to get military bases in the region. And then there's the Bilaspur-Manali-Leha rail link, which will make it so much faster to move troops around. Super important when you're dealing with these remote areas, right? Plus, they're even building new airstrips in Ladakh, including one near the Pangong Lake, which will help get soldiers and supplies where they're needed in no time. But that's not all. The Border Roads Organization, or BRO, is working on improving a bunch of roads, and they're even digging tunnels like the Sela Pass Tunnel to make getting to Arunachal Pradesh easier. All these projects are going to make it way faster for India to move its military in case of an emergency. On top of that, India is also setting up new military bases in Arunachal Pradesh and Ladakh, while upgrading the ones that are already there. And they're boosting communication systems, like better satellites to keep in touch during military operations. And in Arunachal Pradesh, there are even hydroelectric projects happening, which will give energy to the region and help the local economy grow. The big picture here is that all of this is part of a plan to create something called the Northeast Economic Corridor. It's not just about the military. It's about improving the economy and pushing back against China's influence in the region. Pretty clever, right? But wait, if you step back and look at the bigger picture, India's defense and military strength, it's getting pretty impressive. India's defense budget in 2024 shot up to about $75 billion, which is a big jump from $65 billion in 2023. That's a 15% increase, which shows how serious they are about modernizing their military and being less reliant on other countries. And part of that is through Make in India, which is encouraging the country to build its own weapons and defense equipment. They've already set aside $12 billion to buy advanced military gear like fighter jets and naval ships. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. India is forming alliances with a lot of countries to get better military tech. India is working with countries like the US, France, Russia, and Japan. And China? Yeah, they're definitely not a fan of this. For example, India recently made a deal with the US to buy 30 MQ-9 drones worth about $3.9 billion, which will help India keep an eye on things from the sky. Then there's the deal with France, where India already got 36 Rafale jets, some of the best jets around. And they're talking to France about 26 more Rafale marine jets for the Navy. And for the Navy, they've signed deals with France for submarines. On top of all that, India's been doing joint military exercises with Japan and Australia as part of the Quad. This is really important because it helps India's military work better with these countries and ensures that India's a strong player in regional security, especially around the Indian Ocean. In fact, it's not just restricted to Quad. India is getting more involved in international forums like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or the SCO, and the ASEAN Regional Forum. In 2023, India participated in 15 major multilateral exercises, proving it's a serious player in regional stability. All of this is helping India balance out China's assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific. And more countries are looking to team up with India for defense collaboration. Now, India has some big goals for the next few years. By 2025, India wants to be in the top 3 military powers worldwide. On top of that, India is hoping to increase its defense exports, targeting around $5 billion by 2025. And of these countries India exported weapons to, it's none other than the Philippines. It's a weapon that could serve as a major deterrent for the Philippines against China, because what the Philippines have been facing is nothing short of harassment from the CCP. Take a look at this.
Violent confrontation captured by Ivan Watson, who was with the fleet for 48 hours. And you can see China's ships become aggressive. They swarm and they harass the U.S. allied ship, blasting water cannons that were so powerful that the windows shattered.
So to counter this harassment, the Philippines decided to procure BrahMos missile systems from India. In January of 2022, the Philippines concluded a $375 million deal with India for 3 batteries of shore-based anti-ship variant of the BrahMos. And this is going to be a game changer for the Philippines. Now, if you haven't heard of the BrahMos missiles, it's a joint project between India and Russia, and it's one of the most advanced missile systems in the world. It's a supersonic missile and can travel at Mach 3 speed, which means that it can travel at 3 times the speed of sound, and this makes it almost impossible to intercept. It has a range of about 400 kilometers, which means it can hit targets from pretty far away, and it can be launched from land, sea, or air. And this weapon gives the Philippines some serious firepower to defend their waters against China. But that's not all. The Philippines is also boosting its military budget by 12% in 2024, pushing it to around $5 billion. They're looking to strengthen their armed forces even more, which includes flying drones and advanced naval systems, to keep a close eye on things in their territory. This is all a part of their plan to assert their sovereignty, especially with those ongoing territorial disputes in the South China Sea. China is definitely not happy about this. They see the Philippines getting BrahMos missiles as a big deal. For China, this is a shift in the military balance of the region, and it could make them lose some of their control over the South China Sea. So naturally, China has stepped up its game by increasing its military presence, doing more naval patrols, and holding military exercises near those disputed areas. Diplomatically, China has made it clear that they don't want things to escalate, sending out some pretty stern warnings to the Philippines. Now, the BrahMos missile system, as we saw, is actually a pretty big deal for the Philippines, especially when we look at the regional security scene in Asia. Why? Well, compared to a lot of other missile systems out there, BrahMos is fast and seriously accurate. Take China's DF-21 missile, for instance. It's slower and follows a pretty predictable path. Well, adding BrahMos to their defense lineup, the Philippines is sending a clear message. They're prepared to protect their territory and hold the line on regional security. And it's not just about the Philippines. India, as a defense supplier, is making some serious moves in Southeast Asia. The Philippines was the first to buy the BrahMos system, but now countries like Vietnam and Indonesia are showing interest too. It's kind of a win-win. India builds stronger connections in the region, and these countries get the means to defend themselves. China won't have as much if these nations have the firepower to hold their ground. For India, these sales strengthen the defense industry and, in the big picture, contribute to a more stable region, where countries can handle external threats on their own terms. This shift boosts India's influence and keeps China on its toes as it adapts to this challenging security setup. But not all weapons cause physical harm. Some go beyond just physical damage. They might do
emotional damage.
Now, power isn't just about missiles and physical defense. Sometimes it's about economic moves that influence the region just as much, if not more. Indian companies, for example, are starting to build ports in areas where China has territorial disputes, like the South China Sea. One major player here is the Adani Group. So in 2024, the Adani Group, one of India's biggest conglomerates, is going all in on expanding its port projects in Southeast Asia, with plans to build in countries like Vietnam and the Philippines. They're not just building any ports, we're talking about deep-sea ports designed for large cargo ships, which would give these countries a big boost in logistics and make shipping smoother. It's not hard to see how this would help trade flow better between India and Southeast Asia, right? But here's the big question. How do these ports counter China's influence? Well, don't underestimate the impact here. These port developments are actually pretty strategic. They're about giving Southeast Asian countries some independence from China's strong grip in the South China Sea. This region is critical for global trade, with approximately $3 trillion passing through it annually. By investing in port infrastructure in Vietnam and the Philippines, India seeks to provide alternative trade routes, reducing reliance on Chinese-controlled ports. This move not only strengthens India's position, but also reassures neighboring countries concerned about China's assertiveness. Economically, this Adani port expansion isn't just a regional power move. It's also set to give India's own economy a lift. With more trade flowing through these new ports, India could see its trade with Southeast Asia go up by about 20% over the next 5 years. So, with better port infrastructure, India is gaining more influence in these waters. In fact, according to the Indian Navy, operations in the South China Sea are expected to increase by 30% by 2025, which would serve as a deterrent against potential aggressive actions from China. And of course, anytime you start expanding in these waters, it's bound to get some reactions from China, so they're likely to respond by stepping up their activities as well. Now, let's look at some of the port projects in action. First, we have the deep-sea port in Vietnam. This port is built to handle huge ships, which means a big boost for logistics in the region. But it's not just about shipping. This port offers an alternative to China's ports in the South China Sea. It gives other countries in the area more choice, so they don't have to rely on China's ports for everything. Next is the Bataan port in the Philippines. This project is all about trade and security. By investing here, India is helping to build stronger ties with the Philippines, making both countries a bit more secure in the region where things can get, kind of tense. And looking a little further ahead, there's a potential port project in Myanmar. This one could give India direct access to the Bay of Bengal, helping to connect it more easily with the Indian Ocean. Also, India has already made a pretty strategic move in Sri Lanka, where the Adani Group holds a majority share in the West Container Terminal of the Port of Colombo. So this move balances things out a bit. All of these ports aren't just improving trade routes. They're giving India a way to be less dependent on Chinese ports in some really important areas. Sounds great for India, right? But here's the thing. There's this classic saying from Sun Tzu, a famous military strategist. There's no greater danger than underestimating your opponent. And China? Well, they've been making their own moves for years now. Today, China's strategy to build influence around India is known as the String of Pearls. So what's the String of Pearls all about? Well, the Indian Ocean, with key ports and bases, each one carefully chosen by China to secure its interests. It's basically a network that lets China control trade routes and project power in the area. For instance, there's Gwadar in Pakistan. This port is right by the Persian Gulf, giving China access to key shipping lanes. It's a part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, a huge project with roads and railways linking Gwadar to China's own borders. A recent report says Gwadar is about to ramp up trade and give China's navy a solid foothold in the area. Then you must have also heard of the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. When Sri Lanka couldn't pay back its loans to China, China secured a 99-year lease on this port. That was a big deal because China now has serious control in the Indian Ocean. And in Djibouti, China has established a fully operational military base, giving it a strategic position over one of the world's most critical checkpoints, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, through which over 4 million barrels of oil pass daily. But it doesn't stop there. China's influence extends from Hainan Island in the South China Sea all the way through the Strait of Malacca. It built ports in places like Bangladesh, some spots in Myanmar, in Thailand, and in Cambodia. China even spread its reach across the Indian Ocean to places like the Maldives, Gwadar in Pakistan, and some strategic islands around the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf. So this string of pearls is China's way of making sure it has control over key areas across the Indian Ocean. It's a big plan that gives China more power in the region and puts pressure on India to stay on its toes. But despite knowing the dangers, why are countries still collaborating with China? You might have heard of something called debt trap diplomacy. Basically, it's when a country, especially like China in this case, lends out tons of money to smaller, economically struggling countries. And when those countries can't pay it back, well, China ends up taking control of key stuff like ports and infrastructure. It's a pretty sneaky move, and it's got countries like India on edge, because China's moves aren't always just about lending, they're about building influence, which can change the whole balance of power in the region. So the next question is, what is India doing to counter this huge threat from China? Actually, India saw this coming and came up with its own strategy to push back. It's called the Necklace of Diamonds strategy. I know, this sounds like some James Bond stuff, but it's real, and it's all about keeping China's influence in check. So what exactly is this strategy? India's been building up ports, setting up these coastal surveillance radar or CSR systems to keep an eye on China's navy, and even forming closer military bonds with a bunch of other countries. Part of this whole approach is what India calls its Act East policy. Basically, this is a fancy way of saying, let's link up with our neighbors in Southeast Asia. And it's working. India's got military agreements now with countries like Vietnam, Japan, and even Indonesia, all aimed at balancing out China's moves. Now, let's talk about some of the actual projects that India's been working on. Firstly, it's the Chabharar port in Iran. It opens up a new route for India to reach Central Asia, completely bypassing Pakistan. And it's just across from China's Gwadar port, so it's not hard to see the strategy here. Then there's the deep-sea port of Sabang, Indonesia, which sits right by the Strait of Malacca, which is one of the most critical choke points. In fact, India's got access to the Changi naval base in Singapore, also near the Malacca Strait. India is also building up a port in Sittwe, Myanmar, modernizing another one in Mangla, Bangladesh, and it even has access to the Chittagong port. They've also set up an agreement to use naval facilities in Oman, which is super close to the Strait of Hormuz, where over 30% of global oil exports pass. So if you notice the positioning of these ports, they are actually located in some of the most critical locations in the world. To counter China further in the Indian Ocean region, India, along with the big players from the Quad alliance like Japan, Australia, and the US, regularly conduct joint military exercises in the Indian Ocean region, all to show a unified front to keep China's influence in check. Another big part of the Indian plan is the coastal radar networks. India signed a big deal to put up 20 CSR systems along the Bangladeshi coast. It's a pretty smart move because it lets India monitor Chinese warships that keep coming around the Bay of Bengal. In the Maldives, India's got 10 of these radars, with more on the way. In Sri Lanka, India's set up 6 radar systems, and they're planning to add 10 more. Mauritius has 8, and there's even one in the Seychelles, with a plan to add 32 more around the islands. Plus, India is strengthening its own naval bases. Visakhapatnam, on the eastern coast, for example, is getting a $1 billion upgrade. They're adding better surveillance, logistics, and ways to quickly deploy forces if things heat up. And then there's the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which India is turning into major monitoring hubs for sea traffic, with more money going to defense and connectivity. But while most of us only see the big countries like the US, Japan, and India as the powers countering China, we often overlook the regional powers that actually wish to counter China, but they just want backing of a major country. And India identified this pretty well. So India started building relationships with countries in the region. Take Vietnam, for example. They've got a strong partnership with India, doing joint naval exercises and sharing intelligence to keep an eye on the South China Sea. In 2024, they officially tightened this cooperation, making it clear they're concerned about China too. India's been working with Indonesia and Malaysia as well, focusing on things like anti-piracy operations. Just last year, India and Indonesia signed a defense deal to set up their Navy collaboration. Economically, India is also making some big moves. In 2024, they promised over $1 billion for development projects in places like Myanmar and Bangladesh. The idea here is to improve connections and trade routes in these countries, giving them better options besides China. And then there's the Navy. India's been quietly building up its naval strength as a counterweight to China. China might have more ships, but they're cautious about India's growing capabilities. A recent article from China's own Global Times even said that India should use its second nuclear missile submarine responsibly. Now, why would China feel the need to say something like that? It's clear they're paying attention to what India is doing, especially with these new submarines that give India some serious firepower.
This grainy, distant image taken from Vishakhapatnam's Ramakrishna Beach is the only public image of INS Arighat. With no cameras or media present, INS Arighat was quietly commissioned into service at Vishakhapatnam, India's submarine capital, on Thursday.
India's Navy just took a big step forward by bringing in its second nuclear-powered submarine, the INS Arighat. This is a pretty serious piece of tech. It's stealthy, can stay underwater for ages without needing to come up, and has some solid firepower. We're talking nuclear missiles, including some ballistic missiles that can hit targets up to 3,500 kilometers away. That means that even in the worst-case scenario where all of India's land-based nuclear weapons are wiped out, this sub can still strike back from the sea. It's a big deal for India's defense game, especially with the way that China's been moving in the region. Right after the INS Arighat joined India's fleet, China started ramping up its military drills in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. Last year alone, China's been busy with a bunch of naval exercises, rolling out everything from aircraft carriers to submarines, probably to remind everybody about who's boss in the region. But India's picking up on that too. To take this further, the Indian government has allocated nearly $4 billion into the Navy for the 2024-2025 budget year. They're focusing on submarines, new aircraft carriers, and even upgrading existing ships. By 2030, India's goal is to have around 24 submarines and 3 aircraft carriers on ready-to-go mode. That's a serious boost from where things are now, and would put India in a much stronger spot in the Indian Ocean region. Now, this doesn't mean India has got everything to counter China. In fact, you will be shocked to know that China is far ahead in terms of numbers. China's already ahead, with over 60 submarines and 3 aircraft carriers, compared to India's 2 carriers and 16 submarines. The difference really highlights how much India is trying to catch up to keep things balanced in the region. Both sides are constantly watching each other, and every move matters, especially as tensions rise over who gets to call the shots in these waters. India isn't doing this alone, though. In 2024, India joined forces with the US, Japan, and Australia in a big naval exercise under the Quad framework. Over 4,000 Navy personnel took part. These exercises are a way to make sure that if things get tense, these countries can work together seamlessly. And looking forward, India's strategy goes beyond just adding more ships. The Navy is pushing into tech areas like unmanned underwater vehicles and advanced subs, aiming to stay sharp and ready for anything. But the challenge is real. China's strategy of building closer ties with smaller, economically weaker nations in the region gives it a bit of an upper hand in influence. So while India's making progress, there's still a tough game ahead.
For a decade, the country's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative has been a prominent lever of its trade and foreign policies. By funding major infrastructure projects around the world, Beijing can help its own companies on the one hand and improve relations with countries far and wide on the other.
Next, India's take on China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, is a pretty important part of how India is trying to keep China's influence in check, especially around our neighborhood. So, a quick background. China kicked off the BRI back in 2013 with a big goal: to set up a massive network of trading routes and infrastructure projects across Asia, Europe, and Africa. They're pouring money into roads, railways, ports, you name it. On the surface, it's all about boosting global trade, but India's been side-eyeing it from the start. The main worry? China's getting way too close to our borders and to countries we're trying to maintain good relations with. And let's be real, this has serious implications for India's security and its influence in the region. One big part of the BRI is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. Now, this project runs through parts of Jammu and Kashmir that Pakistan controls but India claims. So yeah, India's not really cool with this. They've made it clear that CPEC crosses a line when it comes to India's territorial integrity. In fact, the Minister of External Affairs talked about this just last year, saying India's issues with the BRI are not just about borders. They're also about the risk of smaller countries falling into what's called debt trap diplomacy. Basically, they borrow from China, can't pay it back, and then they end up relying on China long term, like we talked about earlier. But India's not just sitting back. It's been working with Japan on what's called the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, or AAGC. This project is aimed at building up infrastructure and supporting economic growth in Africa. Think of it as an alternative to the BRI, with a plan to invest over $10 billion in the coming years. India is also using this anti-BRI stance to build stronger partnerships with countries that share the same concerns about China. Through the Quad, which includes Japan, Australia, and the US, India is pushing for a free and open Indo-Pacific. And this cooperation is getting serious. In 2024, joint military exercises among the Quad nations jumped by 30%, showing that these countries are really stepping up to secure their interests in the region. From an economic angle, India's rejecting BRI for a reason, to show that it can attract investment without the baggage of debt traps. India's foreign direct investment in 2023 was around $84 billion, which shows that investors are feeling confident about India. The government's also focusing on being transparent and sustainable with infrastructure projects, which is a big plus for countries that don't want to get caught up in China's aggressive financing. On top of that, we've got the Act East policy. It's all about boosting connections with Southeast Asia, especially for India's northeastern states. Then there's the big picture. India's anti-BRI stance is basically a way of saying that it's for a multipolar world, where power isn't dominated by just one or two big players. India wants to keep the region balanced, not just for its own benefit, but for the smaller nations that feel the pressure of China's influence. And here's a recent move that's making waves. India's decided to lease Sri Lanka's Matala airport. This airport's not just any location, it's close to Hambantota, where China's got a big port. Matala's been struggling with low traffic since it opened in 2013. So India, well, they saw an opportunity here. In 2023, Matala Airport saw around 1.5 million passengers, and with India's involvement, that number is expected to rise. With better trade connections and air traffic, India is setting itself up as a solid competitor to China in the region. Over the next decade, India is looking to boost its position in South Asia, focusing on things like infrastructure, trade, and of course, security. The whole Matala Airport deal is a pretty big part of that, especially since it's also a move to balance China's growing influence in the region. And speaking of China, India isn't the only country trying to push back. Actually, in 2007, a group of some pretty powerful countries came together specifically to counter China's influence in the Indo-Pacific. If you've heard of it, it's the Quad Alliance. They basically want to make sure that the Indo-Pacific stays open and free. Countries can trade, navigate, and move around without worrying about any country, like China, trying to throw their weight around. According to the US State Department, the Quad isn't just about military stuff. It's also focused on things like climate change, economic growth, and pushing back against growing authoritarianism in the region. One of the major things that makes the Quad really powerful is their joint military drills, like the Malabar exercises. These drills bring together all four countries' naval forces, and in 2022, they had over 20 ships and submarines involved. It's basically a flex to show that their combined naval power is big enough to challenge China's expanding fleet. But it's not just about flexing military muscles. The Quad countries are also strengthening their security ties. For example, in 2023, India signed a $4 billion deal with the US to upgrade its air defense. It's a huge deal, and it shows just how much trust there is between the two countries. Japan and Australia are also a part of the mix. They share intelligence and do joint training exercises, which makes the security network even stronger. All of this makes it way harder for China to just push its agenda around the region. On the economic side, things are looking pretty good for the Quad countries. They're doing more business with each other, especially in tech and defense. For example, India's trade with the US hit $165 billion in 2023, and India's defense budget also jumped to about $76 billion US. Japan and Australia are upping their defense spending too. So together, the Quad countries have a combined defense budget of nearly $200 billion. All of this is putting some real pressure on China. The Quad has been really active in trying to push back against China's moves in the South China Sea, where China's been trying to expand its naval presence. To keep international waters open, the Quad has been doing these freedom of navigation operations. And the US Navy actually reported that these operations have gone up by 50% since 2021. Obviously, China's not happy about this. And here's the twist. The Quad might actually grow. Countries like South Korea and Vietnam are already looking at getting closer to the alliance. So if more countries join, it could make the whole group even stronger, and that could be a big problem for China. Some experts are saying that an expanded Quad could really shift the balance of power in the region and put more pressure on China's ambitions. So it's only a matter of time before we see who will dominate the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean.